beginning of this state government's term, the omen was not good, particularly on the day that the Premier gave his maiden speech. In the Gold Coast Bulletin of the 18th of May 2012, the heading was, "Joe is my inspiration, Newman." And the Premier, in his first speech as a politician, said that the rehabilitation of Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen is complete because I admire him. Things have gone downhill pretty steadily ever since. But it wasn't always so. For those of you who know about the Vlad laws, the High Court this week in Brisbane will hear a challenge to those laws. You might be surprised to know that in May 2012, the Courier Mail had this heading, "LNP to acts bikie laws." And it said, "Queensland is likely to wind back laws meant to target bikie gangs because the new state government says they can harm people's rights to gather in public." The Attorney-General went on to say, "We have the laws, but we will review them." And he was referring to the Labor laws. He criticised the Labor laws as, quote, "stamping on the civil liberties of people." It is not anti-bikie laws that we oppose, but the Attorney-General said in May 2012, it is anti-association laws we oppose. What did he bring in October and November of last year? Anti-association laws that have seen the Andina Five arrested for having a beer in a pub at Christmas time, that have seen a librarian arrested for having a beer in a pub with a partner when her partner was joined by someone else in the Dayborough pub. So when we look at this government's position on civil liberties, it is cynical, it is a flip-flop position. They have no regard or very little regard for civil liberties. In August 2012, it was reported in the Brisbane Times that where a non-government organisation receives 50% or more of its funding from the state government, the organisation, and I quote from a contract condition that applies to all non-government organisations that get state government funding, quote, "The organisation must not advocate for state or federal legislative change or," and listen to this, "include in their website links to other organisations that advocate for state or federal law change." Now, how anti-libertarian is that?
Yes.
It is not widely known, but now we have under this government any group that receives a significant amount of funding. The prohibition is not against speaking out against the state government or the federal government. That would be bad enough. But the prohibition is against speaking out on any aspect of state or federal legislative change. That's the chill factor that NGOs now face in this state. It was reported in the Courier Mail of the 7th of November 2012 that senior staff of state-funded NGOs received phone calls from senior government public servants telling them that their attendance at rallies protesting against state government spending cuts has been noted by their superiors. So you are being noted. Now, this is not me making this up. This is from the Conservative main newspaper of this state. In November 2012, a Galaxy poll indicated that 1 in 2 voters believed that the Queensland Premier has not lived up to his promises of being open and accountable. When the Newman Government reviewed the Bligh Government's Urban Land Development Authority, the response by the relevant minister to concerns, not by people who are represented here, and listen to who these people are, very conservative people, the response by the relevant minister to concerns about the lack of consultation, and those concerns were expressed by the Local Government Association of Queensland, I don't think they're here, AgForce, I don't think they're here, the Queensland Resources Council, I don't think they're here. What the Deputy Premier Jeff Seeney said was, quote, and listen to this, I must stress how important it is that the limited resources of government are not to be deployed on consultation for consultation's sake. Let me read that again. I must stress how important it is that the limited resources of government are not to be deployed on consultation for consultation's sake. That's what he says to his own support base, to those who oppose his and this government's anti-civil libertarian policies. I'll outline at the end of the speech where we are currently at by reading a letter from the Premier that I received the week just finished. An email sent by the Assistant Commissioner of Police to all staff in October 2013 said this. Now listen to the wording. Eerily reminiscent of the Lewis Bjelke-Petersen regime. Quote, the government considers the Queensland Police Senior Executive have failed to adequately respond to bikies. This is a crisis. It has been compared to a terrorist threat, end quote. Now, this is a Senior Assistant Commissioner of Police sending an email out to his staff. Let me read it again. Quote, the government considers the QPS Senior Executive have failed to adequately respond to bikies. This is a crisis. It has been compared to a terrorist act, end quote. We then had the opinion writer Terry Sweetman say in the Courier Mail at about the same time this, I am not an apologist for pedophiles, and nor will I be an apologist for those who cite the greater good as they trample the laws, ignore the separation of powers, impose their own individual will on the community, denigrate opposing views, refuse to heed expert opinion, and steal away liberty without due process and the right of appeal. I think that's a very accurate summing up of, again, an opinion writer for the Courier Mail describing this government's appalling record on civil liberties. And remember, in November 13, the Courier Mail reported that the state government sacked the entire committee supervising the Crime Misconduct Commission because it questioned the independence of the then acting chair, Ken Levy, after he wrote an opinion piece supporting the government's anti-biking laws. And there was a controversy over whether he was asked to do that by the government of the day. We had this development. In January of this year, the Courier Mail reported, quote, Campbell Newman, he'd just come back from holidays, Campbell Newman has conceded his administration is considered authoritarian and uncaring. How accurate is that? But insisted, don't you worry about that, insisted 2014 will be the year Queensland reaped the benefits of his tough decisions. Well, a mere month later, this is what he was saying about criminal lawyers. And for those who don't understand the system runs with a prosecutor on one side of the bar table, a criminal defence lawyer on the other, an independent judicial officer making decisions. This is what he said about criminal lawyers. Quote, they are part of the criminal gang machine. Wow. And they will see, say and do anything to defend their clients and try to get them off, or indeed progress their sort of case, their dishonest case, end quote. Wow. So that's where the university-educated ex-major of the Australian Army, has got an engineering degree from a tertiary institution. That's how he sees the role of criminal lawyers.
Shame.
So we've had this situation with the police under this government. Back to investigating themselves, a very limited, indeed in a very considerably limited role for the now newly named Crime Corruption Commission for supervising police investigating themselves. We've had the Research Division of the Crime Misconduct Commission, which conducted excellent work over the previous 20 years, looking at issues such as police treatment of Aborigines, producing very good position papers, looking at the misuse of tasers against minority groups, looking at the misuse of capsicum spray. Now, under the reign of the boy Conveyancer General, we now have a law requirement that says that the Research Division has to ask permission of the Attorney General before it undertakes any research at all. Now has to ask permission. Can you imagine the next time, perhaps after G20, if there is excessive police violence against peaceful demonstrators, imagine the Research Division saying to the Attorney General, can we please do some research into what happened at G20? He'll pick up the phone to the Police Minister. Police Minister will say, no way. The Attorney General will come back and say, no. There has been much focus on the change of law that dropped the requirement for bipartisanship approval of the new chair of the CCC. But what has escaped public attention is this more insidious provision. The Research Division, which has done very telling work, making the police service of this state more accountable since 1989, now can no longer do that. They have to ask permission of the Attorney General before they can start any research. I'm coming to the end. When the Attorney General was sworn in, he said, in relation to some criticism by the Civil Liberties Council of some event of the day, well, Terry O'Gorman's had his way for 20 years, his day is over. Well, I'd like to say this. I think the amount of civil liberties achievements that the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties can chalk up over 20 years, you can count on the fingers of one hand. So in terms of the Civil Liberties Council having its way, that is not so. But we have been writing for the last 8 weeks, almost weekly, to the Premier saying, direct your Attorney General to change his policy, which is, I will not consult on anything with the Civil Liberties Council. If you're serious, Mr Premier, about your new attitude post the Redcliffe by-election, post the Stafford by-election, that you're going to listen, that you're going to be consultative, tell him to consult with us. For the first time publicly, I reveal the Premier's response received this week. Dear Mr O'Gorman, thank you for your letters about consultation on law changes. Now listen to the next piece of nonsense. Quote, the Premier is committed to ensuring that appropriate consultation with Queenslanders is undertaken when the government is developing policies and legislation. End quote. Just won't answer the question. Just won't say yes or no, I will direct or I will not direct the Attorney General to consult with the Civil Liberties Council. But listen to the last paragraph. Listen to the arrogance, the overweening arrogance of this man in terms of civil liberties. Quote, to this end, the Premier would be keen to join the Civil Liberties Council, as he is a strong believer in the rights of individuals and is determined to protect the liberty of law-abiding Queenslanders. It would be appreciated if you could provide details of how to join the organisation, end quote. Now, apart from the sheer cynicism, look at the arrogance behind that. Look at the reality. after Stafford, after Redcliffe, he said, I have learned, I'm sorry, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. This man is not sorry. He won't consult. He won't listen to points of view that contradict his own, and he's got to be made to listen at the ballot box. I conclude with a few observations from Matthew Condon, who has written those two seminal books on police corruption in the 80s. The first one was The Three Kings, and the second one was And They All Fell Down. He recently wrote an article in the Courier, which time prohibits me from going into in any detail, but he made these concluding observations. Today, 38 years after, and he was referring to civil liberties excesses in the 70s and 80s, Queenslanders are at the water cooler, talking about an era we thought had long vanished. The context, however, is whether after a little over 2 years of an LNP government, we are heading back to the future. He said, and I couldn't put it better myself, quote, "Ghosts from the Joe days are reappearing, and the regularity of these spectral occurrences is cause for concern." He went on to say, particularly referring to an incident in Musgrave Park and how this government is into high-level media management in order to push out contrary views and promote their own views. And this is the concluding comment. He said, quote, "What may have been forgotten too is the situation in Brisbane's Musgrave Park in May 2012, less than 2 months into the government's first term, when police moved on the Aboriginal tent embassy to facilitate the annual Greek festival. In doing so, the media was managed away from the incident by police in a clearly pre-planned operation." He concluded with this comment, and again, I can't do any better. Quote, "When enough moments of deja vu accumulate, the sensation goes from curious to troubling to fear-inducing. It took decades of hard work and the personal suffering of many to bring some sunshine back into Queensland following the Joe days. If the LNP thinks it can lower a Bjelke-Petersen National Party-style government template over contemporary Queensland, it is in for a rude shock."